Welcome to Syntax, a Generative Introduction, 4th edition. My name is Andrew Carnie. I'm a professor of linguistics at the University of Arizona. I'm the author of your textbook, and I'll be leading you through this series of video tutorials. In the last unit, we talked about the basic terminology we use for describing relationships between noun phrases. We talked about the three different kinds of noun phrases: are expressions, pronouns, and anaphors. And we talked about how we mark the meaning of noun phrases using indexes. And when you have two noun phrases that refer to the same thing, they are said to be co-indexed. The noun phrase that gives its meaning to another element is called the antecedent. Now, in this unit, we're going to talk about the distribution of anaphors. So where do they appear relative to other noun phrases? Recall that anaphors have the property that they must refer back to another noun phrase in the sentence. So, let us start by observing that there are particular syntactic restrictions on the position of anaphors. So, we have the sentence, Heidi bopped herself on the head with a zucchini. As I said in the previous video, please don't take offense at this sentence. This describes a true event, and we were all doing it in good fun. Heidi here is marked with the index I, as is herself, and they are said to co-refer. So the herself here refers back to Heidi. Heidi bopped herself on the head with a zucchini. Now, at the very least, you'll notice that the antecedent comes before the anaphor. But that's not a sufficient condition. Because let's take the sentence, Heidi's mother bopped herself on the head with a zucchini, where this is meant, if you think about the meaning of this expression, the person who bopped themselves on the head with the zucchini is not Heidi. It's Heidi's mother, right? So Heidi's mother is the one who's using the zucchini to hit herself on the head with the zucchini. Heidi is not a possible interpretation of this anaphor. So in our third sentence, I've indicated this with the different indexing, where Heidi has the I and herself has the I. This is an impossible meaning for this sentence. Heidi's mother bopped herself on the head with the zucchini simply cannot mean Heidi's mother took the zucchini and bopped Heidi on the head. It can only mean that Heidi's mother did it. So precedence is not sufficient, because if it was, then the third sentence, the third interpretation of the sentence should be fine. Right? This last sentence with this indexing should be all right, but it's not. Only the indexation, where it's Heidi's mother, the K index, is acceptable. So if we chart this out in terms of a syntactic tree, something will pop out at us, and it has to do with structural relations. We're going to try and capture this intuition. The intuition is that the antecedent for an anaphor can be the subject of a sentence, but it can't be any noun phrase inside of that subject. So that's what the sentences here show you. So Heidi, in the first sentence, Heidi can be the antecedent for herself. They have the same index, and the sentence is fine. But if you embed Heidi inside of the subject, making it Heidi's mother, then the co-indexation between Heidi and herself is not allowed. All right, so let's look at this tree a little bit. Now, I'll start up front by telling you that the tree on the right-hand side, you couldn't draw with the phrase structure rules that I've given you so far, but because it involves this possessive, we're going to fix that problem when we do X-bar theory. So for the moment, just assume that our tree, there's nothing particularly wrong with the trees that I've drawn. Okay, the asterisk on the right-hand side has nothing to do with the tree structures itself. Okay, it has to do with the relationships between the noun phrases. And what we see is that on the left-hand side of the sentence, Look at the noun phrases that bear the index, the left-hand tree. So Heidi bopped herself. Here, the I index on Heidi and the I index on herself are fine. But when you embed Heidi inside of another noun phrase, like the tree on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see that this relationship becomes bad. So Heidi's mother bopped herself cannot mean Heidi hit herself, right? It can only mean Heidi's mother hit Heidi's mother. So what is the difference in relationship between the two noun phrases in the first tree and the two noun phrases in the second tree? Think structural relations. So it's not dominance because there's no dominance relationship between these two noun phrases. It's actually not precedence because in terms of precedence, the precedence relationships in the left-hand tree and in the right-hand tree are identical. Heidi precedes the anaphor herself in both trees. So what's left is C command. And indeed, this seems to be the relevant criteria. So let's look at what the noun phrase Heidi C commands in the first tree. The noun phrase Heidi C commands that entire verb phrase. And we'll see then that the noun phrase anaphor herself is C commanded by the noun phrase that it is co-indexed with. By contrast, the noun phrase Heidi in the second tree, the tree on the right, does not C command herself, right? The only thing C commanded by the noun phrase Heidi is the head noun mother. Herself does not sit within the C command domain, if you like, of the antecedent noun phrase. This is what we're going to use to distinguish the two cases. We're going to put a condition on anaphors such that they must be in the C command domain, if you like, or be C commanded by the antecedent. If they're not, as in the tree on the right, the anaphor is going to be ungrammatical with that interpretation or co-indexing. We capture this notion with a relationship called binding. Now what binding is it's a special kind of C command. And so there are two parts to binding. Binding requires C command. Okay, so A binds B if A C commands B, with the addition that the two noun phrases have to be co-indexed. Now, this is often something that is confusing for beginning syntacticians. They forget that when we're talking about the relationships between anaphors and their antecedents, it's not just co-indexing. It's C command. And it's not just C command also. And it's not just C command, it's also co-indexing. So we have this special term binding that takes those two ideas, that there is a C command relationship and there is a co-indexing relationship, and joins them together, right? If you don't have both of those, you don't have binding. It's a special kind of C command with co-indexation, okay? Now we're going to use this term binding to express where an anaphor can find its antecedent. The condition we have to explain the difference in those sentences we've been looking at is called Principle A. Principle A, which we're going to revise slightly in a few videos, it says that anaphors must be bound. Now what does that mean? That means noun phrases that are marked with self or are plus anaphor must find an antecedent with which they are co-indexed and which C command them. So if you can imagine, the metaphor I like to use is an anaphor has a deep commitment issue. It needs to have an antecedent that co-indexes it and is co-indexed with it. So it looks around and it says, hey, is there something that C commands me that I'm co-indexed with? And if it does, then it is bound and it meets principle A. But if it can't find such an antecedent that is C commanded with it and co-indexed with it, then the sentence is going to be bad with that interpretation. So let's run through those definitions with some trees and we'll see exactly how this works. So here's our trees from before. And we have an anaphor herself. And we want to see the conditions about when that anaphor is going to be okay, when it meets the conditions of principle A. So the first thing we're going to ask is this noun phrase co-indexed with something? And in both trees, this is true. We'll look at the one on the left first. The next question we're going to ask is it C commanded by that thing that it is co-indexed with? And in the case of the tree on the left, it is. That noun phrase is C commanded by the thing it's co-indexed with. So that's yes. That means it's bound. That noun phrase is bound. Okay? And if it's bound, because this is an anaphor, and anaphors must be bound, it meets principle A. Let's contrast that with the tree on the right-hand side. So, this noun phrase herself, is it co-indexed with something? Yes, it's co-indexed with Heidi, just as in the first tree. Is it C commanded by that thing? No, it's not. That means that the anaphor herself is not bound. Anaphors must be bound. So this is a violation of principle A. So the reason why that interpretation, Heidi's mother bopped herself, cannot mean Heidi hit herself, it can only mean Heidi's mother hit herself, is because this anaphor is not bound by its co-indexed antecedent. It's a principle A violation. All right, it turns out there are some restrictions on where the item can find where the anaphor can find its antecedent. We call these restrictions locality restrictions because it appears as if anaphors can only look so far within their sentence in order to find their antecedent. So we notice that in the first sentence on this slide, herself is fine. Herself can find an antecedent in Heidi. And I can tell you that herself here is bound. It is C commanded by Heidi, and it's co-indexed. So that's fine. But look at the sentence, the second sentence. Heidi said that Art danced with herself. Now here, this cannot mean Heidi danced with herself, right? Well, I will make one qualification. There is a dialect of English where that interpretation is possible, but for the vast majority of American English speakers, and most British speakers as well, this interpretation where Heidi is dancing with herself is unavailable. So assume that the judgment that I've given here is relevant. So what's going on here? Why is it that in the first sentence, the herself is okay, but in the second sentence, the herself is not okay? Now you might say to yourself, well, maybe it's because that name Art appears in between. And Art is sort of blocking the relationship. But it turns out that that can't be right either, because let's look at the third sentence here. So this interpretation is also ungrammatical. Heidi said that herself danced with Art. Here, Art isn't intervening between the anaphor and the antecedent. So it can't be the fact that Art is in the middle of the second sentence that's causing the problem, because in the third sentence, Art is at the end. So instead, we have to rely on some other kind of condition. What's the difference between the first sentence and the second two sentences that are where the anaphor is not permitted? The difference is that the anaphor is within an embedded clause. And particularly, it's within an embedded clause that does not contain its antecedent. We sometimes think of this as if the anaphor can only see so far within the sentence to find its antecedent. It has to find an antecedent that's near it. And near here effectively means within the same clause. That's a bit of an oversimplification. We'll talk about, in a later unit, we'll talk about why that's an oversimplification. But it gets at the basic idea that anaphors have to find their antecedents within a very restricted space. And that restricted space is the clause that contains them. We have a special term for this. We call these conditions binding domains. So the main difference between Heidi danced with herself and Heidi said blah, 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 blah herself is that there's an intervening complementizer phrase, right? So herself is within this complementizer phrase, which excludes the antecedent Heidi. So we need to rule out these cases. This idea, which we call binding domain, is effectively the clause that contains the anaphor, or as we'll see in the next video, this also pertains to pronouns. If you can identify the clause containing the anaphor, you must find its antecedent within that domain. So we're going to revise binding principle A a little bit to include this terminology, the binding domain. An anaphor must be bound in its binding domain. So there are really three conditions here. Anaphors need an antecedent. So they need something that they're going to be co-indexed with. Anaphors need an antecedent that C-commands them, right? That defines binding. So if an anaphor finds an item that it is C-commanded with and co-indexed with, then we say it's bound. But even more restrictively than that, it must be bound within the clause that contains it. It must be bound within its binding domain. So compare these sentences. Heidi danced with herself, and Heidi said that herself danced with Art. The first one is grammatical, the second one is ungrammatical. So let's run through our conditions. In the first tree here, the noun phrase is in fact co-indexed with an anaphor, or more correctly, the anaphor is co-indexed with its antecedent noun phrase. So that condition is met. Does that noun phrase C-command herself? The answer to that is yes. They are in a C-command relationship. That means they are bound. Okay, so that's the first part of our condition A. Are they bound? The anaphor must be bound. The second thing is it bound within its binding domain? And so that refers to the clause that contains the anaphor, the first clause up, if you like. So this anaphor herself, if you look up the tree, the first clause that contains it is the whole sentence. And indeed, the element that binds it is within that same clause. So it's bound within its domain, and that means it meets condition A. Let's contrast that with the second sentence, the one where Heidi said that herself danced with Art. First of all, is it co-indexed? Yes, it is co-indexed, just as it is in the other tree. Is it C-commanded? And yes, this is true too here as well. So it is indeed bound. The sentence is still ungrammatical. Why is it ungrammatical? It's ungrammatical because it's not bound within its binding domain. So the anaphor looks up the tree and sees a CP, and it can't see beyond that CP for its antecedent. So it's ungrammatical. It is not bound within its domain. This is very subtle technical language. It is bound, but it is not bound within its binding domain. Be very careful not to mix up binding and indexing and binding as being in the same domain. They are each separate definitions. If this is confusing, please go back and review the definitions I've already given you. So that sentence is going to violate principle A, which explains its ungrammaticality. When you're doing problem sets and binding theory, there's a temptation to try and fix the sentences. So there'll be a temptation to change Heidi said herself danced with art, and change it into Heidi said she danced with art. This is not the point of binding theory. Binding theory is to explain why certain sentences are unacceptable. So when you're doing problem sets in binding theory, don't try to fix the sentences. Instead, try to identify why they're either grammatical or ungrammatical. That's an important part of trying to figure out why the structural relationships in the tree are relevant. Yes, you can fix the sentences, but that's not our goal. Our goal is to explain why some sentences are acceptable and others are not. So, let me summarize what we've talked about so far. Principle A, which is the condition on anaphors, imposes two restrictions. The first restriction is that anaphors must be bound, and that means they're both C-commanded and co-indexed with a noun phrase. And the second condition is that anaphors must be bound within their own clause. That is, they find an antecedent within their clause. Note, again, that it's not just that anaphors need to be bound. It's not just that anaphors have to be co-indexed. They have to be bound, and they have to be bound locally. Now, in the next video, we're going to talk about pronouns. And pronouns are interesting because they have almost the opposite set of restrictions. But we're going to see that pulling these two ideas apart, the difference between binding and the difference between being locally bound or bound within its binding domain, is going to explain a whole set of facts about the interpretations of pronouns.